Apparently, we have people from many, many countries on this call, from several, at least a dozen, if not more than that, probably a lot more. So maybe in the Q&A at some point, just say where you're from, and we would love that. But it's an absolute privilege. We were just chatting just now about this event called Architects and Disaster Recovery, working with communities recovering from disasters. So I'll start reading my notes because the risk of ad-libbing means I'll go down rabbit holes. So good afternoon in Australia and good early morning if you're Europe or elsewhere. Welcome to the first of two webinars with that title. My name is David Sanderson. I'm lead for How We Survive at the University of New South Wales here in Sydney, Australia, which has organised these events. And a big shout out to my colleague and friend Kate Brady, who's behind this, who thought of it, and to our good friends at ADAR, the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, with whom we're partnering for this event. And the second one is this Thursday at the same time, so please get ready for that if you're not signed up. And the idea is that we're going to talk today around post-disaster recovery, and on Thursday we'll be talking about, if you like, pre-disaster planning. There will be another one, maybe, probably. How do we get ready? Now we know in many ways that's artificial, but it's a great way to do it. So today we're talking about architects, communities after a disaster, a flood or a bushfire, an earthquake or other things or a windstorm. But before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm sitting right now in the unceded lands of the Gundungurra people. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and those who might be on the call today. And invite you to do the same in the chat if you're from Australia or New Zealand, or indeed from the culture you're from. A little bit about how we survive, the thing that you see behind me on my screen at the back there. How we survive is about reshaping disaster recovery so that people's voices are central to actions taken. If you like, nothing about us without us. All the evidence is that disaster recovery is better when people are at the center of decisioning, and yet too often, almost certainly well-intended responding organizations tend to not do that well enough. So we want to change that narrative. We're long-term independently funded, so we're in the fortunate position to try out new stuff, hence these two events. And this is the very first one we've put on. The idea in the future is to focus on other professions or vocational skills, if you like. Maybe that's social workers or people working in IT, and to get people who really know what they're talking about to talk about what it means to engage with communities before and after disaster from their respective professions. What works, what doesn't, what we can always do better. We can always do things better. So to help us, we'll be sending out a feedback form at the end of this event. Please tell us what you thought, how it could be better. Almost certainly me saying less will be the absolute definite thing, and more of our colleagues, but then also any great ideas about what we should be doing next, because we'll be doing more of these. But today, the first of two, we're talking about architects, communities, and disaster recovery. And I confess an interest in this. When I trained as an architect in the 1980s in the UK, I was told by a professor from the US that the role of architects in this area was, quote, marginal at best. And I was utterly crestfallen because I was 24 and I was going to change the world. It took me a long time to understand what that meant. What he actually meant was it's the way we're taught and the things that we use and when we use them are not about being a profession as an architect. So I just want to say it's how you do it. And I think our three talented and experienced speakers will speak to that. But I'm the host, not the panelist, so I'll stop right there. So to discuss what it means to be an architect working with communities after a disaster, we have three, and I really mean this, really excellent, really experienced panelists. I couldn't think of a better lineup. Not that I did it, Kate did it, each bringing deep experience of architects, architecture, and disaster. So the format we have today, and we'll finish no later than in Sydney time, just check that, 1:30, an hour and a half, so we have a lot of time. Each of our three guests, I'll provide a very brief introduction and big them up and make them feel very uncomfortable with all their laurels and everything, and then ask them to talk for 15 20 minutes, something like that. We're quite relaxed, we have time. After the first person, I'll then ask maybe one or two questions because I won't be able to resist. We'll go into the second speaker, I'll introduce them, and so the third, and then we'll open up to Q&A. We have a Q&A thing, as we can see, and you're all extremely welcome to ask whatever questions you like. What we've done for each speaker is to pose three questions to give a brief summary of the work they've been involved in, to provide advice to their younger selves, the second one, and the third to identify what architects should know about working with communities. And we have said be a bit provocative, a bit edgy, constructively so, but the ready assumption is we can always do better in everything that we do. So, enough from me. I should say our three panelists are Brett Moore, Elizabeth Mossop, and Christy Breyer, and I'll introduce each of those in that order. And Brett, we're going to ask you to start off. Brett is a good friend to a lot of us. Brett has worked in more than 20 countries over the last 25 years. He doesn't look that old, but he is, with NGOs, government projects, and 13 years with the United Nations. He spent the last year with the United Nations Refugee Agency as the chief of shelter and settlement. So that's the top job that does a lot of coordination and really gets shelter and settlements going. Brett holds a bachelor's degree of design and planning, and a bachelor of architecture. He is an adjunct professor at RMIT University, and between 2015-16, Brett was a Loeb Fellow at Harvard University. So, Brett, over to you.
Thank you very much, David, for that kind introduction. Maybe a little bit too praiseworthy. I think I've had many very average experiences in the meantime and stumbled my way from one role to another. But I'm really pleased to be able to share what I have today with colleagues online and those interested from various walks of life or really where they're located in their particular careers. And thanks also to Kate for pulling the event together. Now, have I got the slides in front of me? I do. I don't. I can try again. Share. Okay. Can you give me the thumbs up or?
Yes, we can see that.
Very good. Okay. Thanks, David. So I'll just begin my presentation giving you a really quick run through of the context that we're facing now, and then a little bit of information about how I got into it and what I think are the key steps for architects and built environment professionals to consider if they want to go into this line of work. We're now in really an unprecedented situation in history. There's around 120 million people globally displaced. That's refugees, people pushed across international borders, but also IDPs, that is internally displaced people. Now, these figures are those really that are long-term displaced. I'm not really talking about people that are displaced by disaster for the short term. We don't even have good figures on that, but it would be in the hundreds of millions annually that have pushed from their homes, that have their incomes, livelihoods affected. But a lot of people, they're able to cope with the situation they're in with government support, with local community support, and they are often not away from home for very long. But just to help look at the global context really of more this long-term displacement, I've got some interesting data here really looking at the escalation in the number of displaced people, and you can see it's really well up into the 120 million, 130 million by now. The data on the bottom shows when we overlay where the people are displaced, how that intersects globally and specifically related to where people come from that are also areas impacted by conflict. So I'm showing this piece of information to say that there's a clear link. It isn't necessarily a causal link, but it's a self-informing and referential link between those people that are displaced by climate hazards, but also conflict. And they're really inextricable. Within the system, within the industry, we often separate those people that are climate displaced from disaster displaced. In countries like Australia, it certainly does make sense to do so. But for the vast majority of people displaced around the world, it really is inextricable. For example, if you're a farmer from Somalia and you had been subject to Al-Shabaab and the conflict going on there for many years, you've moved from one place to another, there'd been a drought, you've lost your flock of camels or goats, you've got a livelihood impact, it's forced you to move to the periphery of a big city like Mogadishu. It's not easy to differentiate really whether you're displaced because of a conflict or displaced because of climate and disaster. It's a mix of both, and it varies in intensity and frequency as time goes along. We surely do know that there are a lot more conflicts and the intensity and frequency of disasters is increasing. But of course, the impact on particular people and where that happens depends on the resilience of the built environment, of political systems, and of other factors as well. Those people that keep getting subject to conflict and disaster tend to have less in their tank. They tend to be able to have less assets that they have accumulated and to maintain those assets as they go through periods of stress and shock. There are global processes to the response, though, and I'll speak a bit about my experience. The last 20 years, I've worked in various disaster contexts. Most recently, as David mentioned, with UNHCR, I had 8 years as chief of UNHCR Shelter and Settlement Program based in Geneva, and also the coordinator of the Global Shelter Cluster on behalf of UNHCR. So I'll speak really here just about the fact that there is a coordination process going on. It's mostly set up to respond to disasters and conflict, but there isn't enough resources adequately provided at the preventative side of the equation. That is, whether we talk about conflict mitigation, peace building, or whether we talk about disaster risk reduction as a means of reducing the impact of disasters that may happen in the future. So there are global processes, but it's a question of sustainability. When we've got vastly increasing need, as I showed on the second slide, but we now know due to reductions in donor support that there's a lot less money to go around to meet the needs of people that are displaced, and also there's not a coherent link through to build resilience and to look at the recovery and reconstruction processes. So that kind of disaster management cycle that we're all familiar with, we really find that it's disjointed in many ways, partially funding, partially because of lack of coherent processes, and partially due to the inability of governments, the private sector, and others to adequately respond to continuity of those processes as they overlap either at local level, provincial or state, or sometimes national level. So when we're looking at this context, what are the big drivers and what are the big features? Many of you would recognise that we've got vast urban growth, and that urban growth tends to feature most predominantly in the medium-sized cities. Of course, the mega cities are growing fast, but when you look at the most rapid urbanisation globally, it tends to be in medium-sized sub-Saharan cities, which may well add another 1 million people onto their population every couple of years. A lot of this is also cyclic, as people go into a city to seek refuge or recovery and then might go back to a rural area. So it is increasing, but it's also increasing in a cyclical fashion. Global population growth, of course, is another key factor. Population is growing everywhere, but it's also sporadic. And the largest population growth is often in those middle to low income countries, but also in countries where the political and educational institutions, job opportunities are least able to absorb the needs of the growing population or respond to the needs of the growing population. As mentioned before, we've got the latest estimates around disaster cost is that it's around, say, $500 billion a year, give or take. That's also hitting some countries more than others. And most of that disaster cost is around what we say hydrometeorological events, floods, storms, etc. Further compounded in areas that are also subject to conflict, as I mentioned earlier. Now, what we're not really talking about so much is the reconstruction cost. The cost of disasters is one thing, but the reconstruction is in its trillions, largely because the cost of reconstruction in developed country context is very expensive. Materials are expensive, labour is expensive, and the ability of the global underwriting system to really respond to that is now quite stretched. We see this in parts of Australia, which are now virtually uninsurable. Those areas that are subject to constant inundation, really severe floods, sometimes 2 or even 3 times a year. Now, what does this mean for many of us who come from a background as a built environment professional? You might be a planner, you might be an architect, you might be an engineer. For most of us, we are trained in the private sector. If you go through architecture school in most countries in the world, they produce you to work in the private sector. Many of you will get a job in a small architecture firm or a small engineering firm or something similar. And we often don't find a way to coherently link to these big global pressing issues. But I'll lead up to the next two slides. I'll give some opportunities and some ideas for how professionals from the built environment background can actually try to apply their skills to these global challenges. So we talked about urbanisation and climate change. We're also in a situation now where really with displacement, it's led to this cycle of chronic fragility in many countries. Of course, in many countries, there's been decades of unattended poverty, which has never really been properly alleviated. And that's inbuilt a lot of risk into the social systems, into the political systems, which leave them more vulnerable to the shocks and stresses of disasters and climate. As mentioned earlier, the funding and the capacity to respond is reducing, even though the needs are increasing. And I think it's fair enough to say that there's a lot of political and social disengagement. Maybe this is partly to do with social media. Maybe there's other causes as well. Maybe that's part of a donor fatigue, which has also reached the community. But a lot of people find these issues too hard to comprehend and too hard to deal with and just think, I can't deal with it and the authorities will respond. But in the end, the disasters know no boundaries, and sooner or later, it relies on all of us and some ability to kind of work out how we can comprehend, prepare for, and respond to disasters which may manifest locally. So a role for us. I think it's sometimes easier just to take a moment to speak of how did I get on this path and what hope does that hold for anyone else? Now, by this, I don't mean that anyone has to follow the path that I went along, because there wasn't really a path. I think that at least now you can actually do really well-designed further study. It could be a master's in international development, a master's in international humanitarian law, climate. There's a lot of different tertiary opportunities out there now which didn't really exist 25 years ago when I started work originally in this field. But just a quick overview there, as I studied architecture and planning at the University of Melbourne with some overseas study also at the time in America and then also Rome, finished university and worked as many graduates do in a small design firm. But I was always really interested in these social issues and the issues of developing countries. I didn't have the language at the time to really understand what that meant, but I knew that I was interested in these kind of overlap between the built environment, between human rights and politics, and how could I try and forge a path in that area. I started working as a volunteer originally in Vietnam, and then soon after that there was the independent struggle of East Timor to gain independence from Indonesia. And I was sent over on an Australian government funded project to help with the recovery and reconstruction work in Dili and other parts of East Timor. And that really soon led me on a very separate journey, which I have continued for the rest of my life. I started working with NGOs, originally World Vision, in Sri Lanka after the tsunami. I went over on a 6-month contract, but I stayed for 5 years on the northern tip of Sri Lanka in Jaffna. And then soon after that, I joined the UN and they sent me to many countries after that. I spent 10 years working in Asia in various locations, quite a while in East Africa, 4 years in the Middle East. And during all of those assignments in around 20 countries, some were conflict related, where I was working in a refugee context, but most of them were disaster related. Typhoons, storms, floods in Asia Pacific, earthquakes. My role started very junior, more as program or project officer, to working up to something more senior. The last significant role I had when I was with UNHCR was working in Ukraine and also working in the Middle East, working on behalf of the UN with the EU and the World Bank on a multi-donor trust fund to try to gear resources and investments into recovery work in both Ukraine and in the Middle East. I was awarded the Loeb Fellowship 2015-16, which is a great opportunity for me to take time out as at that point as a mid-career professional to look at urban resilience and disaster resilience, particularly within an American context. The 8 years that I had with UNHCR, I was running the global program. That was in both disaster contexts and refugee contexts. We had a big team of around 240 professionals across 42 countries, mostly as shelter officers, settlement officers, program officers, and they really worked across the whole gamut of disaster response, recovery, and reconstruction. I've dabbled in academia throughout that time, guest lectures here and there, became an adjunct professor in 2016 with RMIT. I've recently completed some more study in international humanitarian law, disaster law, and climate change law in the last month or two, which has helped me look at the kind of higher level issues under which the kind of work I had been doing previously is located. And I'm pleased to be associated with the University of New South Wales for this work and for others in the last couple of years. So what can you do? When you're working as a built environment professional, what kind of skills are needed? What do you bring to the job? I've just kind of grouped them broadly here. At the junior level, you're really involved in studies, costings, damage assessments, and proposals. But the interface with community is really, really critical. And often you spend lengthy time in consultation and feedback. The top shot on the left there was when I was in a refugee camp in Mauritania, looking at different issues and options for upgrading that camp. You use some basic planning and design skills as well at the individual level of a building, whatever building it may be. It could be a house, it could be a school, a clinic, a hospital, or something else like that, a rudimentary kind of building, at least in an emergency. And also site design. So that's really when you're working at the interface between the building and the landscape at various scales. And also working in teams and leading teams. I think these are really critical roles for architects. I think that the most important thing that you can do is understand how a building goes together, how to cost and manage it, and how to deliver it in a really complicated context. Often they're not as complicated as the buildings we may be building in a developed country context, but the real determinants and difficulties are around lack of resources, lack of money, and certainly lack of time. So I really encourage any of you that are thinking of these things to think of your basic skills. They can be applied. And I think that anyone who's interested in looking at this kind of work, it's just a little bit around thinking through how your core skills can be adapted to wildly differing contexts in different places around the world. And in the end, are humanitarian needs that different? No, they aren't that different. Shelter is akin to housing, but we talk about the process more than the product. Really, oops, I think I just missed that slide. Really here, it's very, very important for us to understand. Sorry, let's go back to that slide. Won't be a second. Is it back?
No, not yet.
Okay, I'll try one more time. It's jumped off my screen. There we go. This is my last slide. So really what we're talking about here is applying our knowledge. So most architects, their bread and butter tends to be housing. In the emergency context, we're talking about shelter, but really it's applying your knowledge to a different kind of product in a different kind of context and really bring out some important skills. Consultation, negotiation, innovation. So speaking with people broadly and trying to apply your ideas in a different kind of way, knowing a project, knowing a budget, and knowing how to manage it through a very complicated process. But how do we respond to the needs of people in developing countries? Is it really just around building resilience? Yes, it is about that, but ultimately resilience may not be all that's needed. It's an overall framework, but it doesn't always give us the answers for everything that we're looking at. We need to look really at some kind of critical environmental aspects. We need to think of more than just basic habitation. We need to think about what will happen to the people that we're serving well after we're gone. The triple bottom line is really important here. Understanding something about conflict and something about disaster and how the humanitarian world works is also critical to be able to apply our knowledge. We always work in a multidisciplinary kind of team. Traditionally a community of the UN and the NGOs and others, but now increasingly the private sector. But ultimately, we're looking for people that are motivated, people that are prepared to spend time, a month, 3 months, 6 months or longer in another country, and people that are prepared to volunteer as well, to take the essence of their skills, their intuition and their humanitarian beliefs into another place, to do the best they can and help people in need. I'll leave it at that, and we've got more time for questions at the end, but thanks very much, and I will hand back to David now.
Brett, that was amazing. I mean, what a story. And I'm sure everybody else listening to you now, it's a rare moment to get to hear somebody with such experience and varied background, very candidly talking about how you get into things and what matters and all those things. I've got a million questions for you, but I'm just going to quickly ask you one. You mentioned things are harder now, and for those following the international aid news, massive cuts in humanitarian operations, and no one doubts there was a need for reform, but this has been very dramatic and very painful. And I just want to ask you, Brett, of all that, there's that context of those things, but at some point we'll be left with the essence of what to focus on. And what do you think is the essence of what works when it comes to disaster response and recovery?
Thank you, David, for the question. Not the easiest one to answer in a minute or less, but I'll do my best. I think the system has evolved a lot. When I first began, there were a lot of very resource poor places in the world. So the systems were set up around emergency distribution of goods. Global warehouses were established for sending out tarpaulin tents and basic non-food items. In many countries now, they're readily available. I mean, you can go to the smallest village in Somalia and still find every plastic bucket, broom or mop that you might need to help you, through the most kind of rudimentary processes. What I think now, with the big budget cutbacks and the way the global machinery is really reordering itself, is that things will have to go back to basics.
Mm.
I also think at the same time that there's been a lot of people from the global south, from developing countries, who have had a lot of experience and can lead processes now as well. So I think we should see ourselves as enablers, as agents, as supporters, rather than leaders having to go to another country to do work. I think multidisciplinary teams are really important, but I also think that working in that really local grassroots way is the way things will be going forward. Budgets are tight, but certainly it'll still be around food, water, shelter in many, many ways. You can't really get away from that post-disaster. The delivery mechanism and those that compose the teams might change, but the basics of human existence are still there. What I think will be hard is prioritization. As needs grow, who are those that will really get support and who are those that will be left to fend for themselves, without sounding too negative. But thanks, David.
No, thanks, Brett. Absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure there are lots of questions from those on the call. Hold off, we'll hold on to those, and then we'll come back when we do the wider Q&A. Thank you, Brett. Now it's my complete privilege to introduce Elizabeth Mossop. Elizabeth's done everything, so sorry, I'm going to make this quite short. Elizabeth Mossop is Professor of Urban Resilience and the former Dean at the University of Technology, Sydney School of Design, Architecture and Building. She is a founding principal of Spackman, Mossop and Michaels Landscape Architects, based in Sydney and New Orleans, where you were based for a number of years. Elizabeth has been involved in many aspects of post-disaster reconstruction of New Orleans and the ongoing revitalization of Detroit and elsewhere also, and very busy up as in the Northern Rivers as well around Lismore. With an academic career spanning 25 years, Elizabeth was, among other things, director of the Masters of Landscape Architecture program at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design. So, absolute privilege to have you here, Elizabeth, and over to you.
Thank you so much, David, for that lovely introduction. And so I'm going to start out by talking about how I have come to work in this space. I'm not a building architect, I'm a landscape architect. And I've always combined academic work with practice. And most of my early career was very much working on planning and design for public space, for parks and open space, for urban spaces, for town centres. So sort of at the intersection of public space design, the public realm, and sort of urban design scale things. But I went to the US in 1999 and was lucky enough to be in Louisiana when Hurricane Katrina happened. I had just moved down there the year before, many plans. I'd moved down there to be head of a big school of landscape architecture. And so this massive disaster changed everything. I was peripherally affected, but barely impacted at all. And the school that I was running was not in New Orleans, but it completely transformed my practice and my work. And so I was involved in the post-disaster environment in a range of different ways. And I should say, it's important to remember, I think, how few of these disasters are natural disasters. The disaster in Louisiana and the Gulf Coast was not Hurricane Katrina. The disaster was the failure of the levee system, which was an entirely human-created disaster. Like many of these disasters, it took a number of decades, but that was the disaster, not the hurricane itself. In the aftermath of the hurricane, I was involved with a number of initiatives to do with post-disaster planning. There was something called the Bring Back New Orleans Commission, assembled by the mayor. Later on, of course, like so many Louisiana politicians, ended up in jail. But that was a very interesting process and it was made up of people from across the community brought together. I was part of the sort of the urban design group. So, bringing together people across a range of disciplines, a range of expertise to really work on some of these questions. We later on all got the sack and were replaced by a firm of consultants. So a lot of things about that planning environment were very chaotic. And I should say, in the year immediately following the hurricane, there were 6 or 7 plans done for the city. Many of them philanthropically funded, so quite a different environment to the one we find ourselves in Australia. And they were eventually brought together in one plan. I was also involved with the founding of something that was called the Coastal Sustainability Studio. So this was an initiative at Louisiana State University to try to provide better advice and better expertise to government, because we had a state government without a lot of experience of any kind of planning. And so I worked with colleagues in engineering and in coastal science, as well as in the College of Art and Design, to develop this studio, which worked with communities and also undertook research and supported government in the making of plans. And I was then later on involved through the practice that I established a couple of years after the hurricane with a colleague. We were involved in a whole range of projects. Initially, many of those projects were to do with the vacant residential land across the city, but then as funding began to come in from the federal government, there were a lot more site scale and infrastructure projects that were recovery and rebuilding projects, but also, they were all oriented towards these questions of how to make this highly vulnerable city more resilient. So having established a whole lot of expertise around these questions of urban vacancy, we were then hired to do what has turned into a really interesting body of work in Detroit, another sort of, I would say, post-disaster city. In that instance, an economic disaster and a disaster of sort of governance and corruption, again, created over many decades. But so I was then involved with a whole series of projects to do with this sort of trying to bring the city back after its bankruptcy and how to deal with these massive areas of devastation and vacancy across the city. After returning to Australia in 2016, we sort of, in a very, very different cultural, political, and physical environment, reflecting on this work as we lived through the bushfires, I tried very unsuccessfully to establish a kind of a laboratory to work in these places that had been destroyed by fire, to try to partner with local and state government to sort of bring some of the expertise that we had. Anyway, none of that worked. But then in the aftermath of the catastrophic floods in the Northern Rivers in 2022, we formed a partnership between the University of Technology in Sydney and the regional university, Southern Cross University, and were successful in partnering with the New South Wales state government to establish what is now the Living Lab Northern Rivers. And again, this was, very much sort of motivated by trying to bring this expertise from other places to bear, to try to prevent the reinvention of the wheel in this post-disaster environment. And the sort of, and to just also to sort of adapt and develop some of the methods of working that we had used in the US. And I would encourage you to have a look at the Living Lab Northern Rivers website, because that will show you a whole lot of the projects that we have done in that region in the last 3 years. And so this was, and so this is a whole area of interest and expertise. It is related to the sort of public domain work of the first half of my career. And certainly having spent a lot of time working in public with communities, with complicated areas of governance and different levels of government, that was incredibly useful. But the sort of all of the technical aspects around the disasters, flooding, designing with water, sponge cities, all of that, is something that sort of really came to me from that environment. And what I see now, particularly being back in Australia, is that the sort of working with disasters, working in post-disaster environments, it is something that is coming to so many of us. These are no longer isolated events. They are very much part of the fabric of our lives. These are, we are part of these cycles, and we are now in an age of this climate instability. And so many of us, whether we work in the regions or whether we work in cities, we need to be thinking very clearly about how we are building these ideas and this kind of expertise into our work all the time. And I know many of you will also be very highly motivated by the urgency of dealing with the issues related to the climate crisis. And so whatever your practice is, you will be dealing with these issues in one form or another. And I guess, one of the things that strikes me, and again, my experience has been in the US and it has been in Australia. And one of the things that I find most striking in these post-disaster environments is the total absence of architects and design professionals and built environment professionals in the decision-making conversations, in positions of influence and power, and where the decisions are being made about resources. And this, I think, is an absolute tragedy, because, architects, and I'm just going to use that word to talk broadly about built environment professionals, and of course the queen of professions, landscape architecture. But, we have this very broad, creative, synthetic disciplines. Some of the very, very few disciplines that bring together technical expertise with creativity. The problems of post-disaster environments are a big, giant mess. They are so complicated. They are specific to their places and to their culture. There are certain universal things that you can learn, but so much of what you have to do is learn quickly, be thoughtful, listen to people, come up with solutions that are specific to communities and specific to place. And I honestly believe that our disciplines are best placed to undertake this work. And to me, it's just another example of the failure of these disciplines, the failure to demonstrate their social and cultural value more broadly. People should be crying out for architects to be working in this space. And so, if I think about what, people who want to work in these places, who are thinking about this kind of work, who are drawn to it, or who have this work sort of forced upon them, I think, to me, leadership and advocacy are tremendously important. I think they are not usually an effective part of our education. We see so few creative people in politics, in roles of leadership. And, you know, not everybody is suited to these things, but those of you who are, I would strongly encourage you to develop your skills in this space, to think about running for office. Imagine if local government were not full of real estate agents and retired teachers, and instead was full of designers and architects and planners. You have to really educate yourselves about climate adaptation. It is nice to think about mitigation, but it's too late. We are, we are way past the nice limits of 1.5 degrees of global warming. It's obvious that in Australia we are kind of already cooked. Don't get me wrong, there is obviously a role for mitigation. We want to do what we can to improve performance and to improve situations where that is possible. But we also have to really understand what is required in terms of adaptation. You will all be working in environments where extreme heat is present. That is the biggest killer of all of these climate disasters in this country and everywhere else. So many places that you are going to be working are going to be affected by sea level rise, are going to be affected by flooding, are going to be affected by major storms. Drought is going to be with us. All of these things, you've got to understand how all of these are going to continue to affect the places that you work. And there is no need to reinvent the wheel in this space. You can learn so much from other people's experiences. And in my view, the big challenge that we have in Australia, but in many places, is what we need is a cultural change. We need to move the spending from after the disasters to the work of mitigation and adaptation before the disasters. We know that every dollar that you spend before the disaster is going to save you somewhere between $10 and $15 after the disaster. There are such powerful economic arguments for this work, for which you are uniquely qualified. Sadly, this kind of thinking does not work well on political cycles. But so that's the powerful cultural change that we really need. And your technical skills are incredibly important. Your ability to think creatively, to put together different kinds of physical solutions. This is what the design professions have that nobody else does. However, the social and political skills trump everything else. If you can't be effective in that space, it doesn't matter how much of a genius architect you are. Nobody cares. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more in a minute about what these social and political skills are. And the thing that I learned, particularly out of the post-Katrina work, was the absolute primacy of skills in communication. I have come to understand that communication is one of the reasons why I think the design and built environment professions have failed, because no one understands what you are talking about and nobody can read your drawings. I used to think there were different kinds of audiences. You know, I used to think there was a government audience and there were professional audience and then there's a community audience. What I think now is there's just one audience. People have an average reading age of about 11, and no one can read plans. They certainly can't read sections. People can understand models. They can understand three-dimensional and realistic drawings. And you have got to become, if you want to be effective in these environments and you want to have a seat at the table, the way that you communicate with people is absolutely vital to this. And so the last question we're asked to answer is, what do you wish that more architects understood about disasters and about their potential role in working with communities? So, as I have said, what I wish everybody else understood was just how useful architects are in this environment. And I see that as being perhaps the biggest challenge for advocacy and public education, is to make that case. But so I want to remind everybody that the solutions in this space are just as often they're cultural, they're economic, they're programmatic, as they are physical. And so you have to understand enough about these questions and about the challenges of your place and your disaster to really be open to what the solutions might be, and they will probably be hybrid. So that you've got to, like with all of the work we do, you have to inform yourself about the issues and about the place. And remember that nothing beats lived experience. You know, my understanding of this space was profoundly changed by living through Hurricane Katrina. And whether you have had that personal experience or not, that you have to be able to give that primacy. So that means that you have got to be able to engage with and listen to communities. And those might be professional communities, Indigenous communities, business communities, schools, community groups, neighborhoods, could be anything. And you have to think about how are you going to access and include the people who are often left out of these conversations. You've got to use a range of very, very different methods to do this listening and to do the kind of engagement and co-design that I think is required. That means you've got to meet people where they are. You can't expect them to come to you. If you work in a disaster-impacted, trauma-impacted place, nobody cares about what it is that you want to do until people have their basic needs met. They can't engage with you on anything else. They're not interested in your projects. And so you really have to understand a lot about how the disaster works and how the post-disaster environment operates to really understand where people are and to try to give yourself some insight into what it is that they have been through. Because for most of us, we've just got no conception of what it is actually like to live through these kinds of experiences. And you've got to understand that it's nobody's job to help you to find your solutions. You cannot make these into the sort of extractive relationships that we so often see in these post-disaster environments. So that these are a whole, these are a whole lot of of new skills that we all need in order to be effective. And yes, you need them in a post-disaster environment. I would suggest that they will make all of your practice better. But the good news is that, you know, all of your creativity, all of your problem-solving skills, which is at the absolute heart of your education and experience, that's what you're going to need in order to be effective in this space. And that's what you're going to use to work on and develop the sorts of methods that you will need to engage with and communicate with people in these very, very complex environments. So I'm going to leave it there.
Wow, that was a tour de force. I'm just sitting here agreeing and nodding, and all the stuff you said about designers not having a seat at the table, that of course it's about governance at every single level, that if we don't communicate effectively, we're sunk, that we need to be involved in politics and governance and social issues and be able to speak and present. And there's so much richness there. I just want to ask you one question, just briefly, if I may. You have a rich background as a practitioner and an educator. What's the one thing that needs to change in design slash architecture slash landscape architectural education to make us more relevant?
I think that's very difficult to answer. I think what we are seeing, what I am seeing with young practitioners, I'm seeing so much more engagement with these big social and cultural questions. And I am seeing so much inventiveness and creativity around forms of practice. I think that is a huge part of it. But for me, the biggest area of change is around the sort of intersection of communication skills and relevance. And, and so as an educator, that's where I would be putting my money and my resources and my time.
Yeah. And may I say, I've seen you in operation in the Northern Rivers at various community workshops, and my observation is you're designing with your ears. It's about that listening process, not with your hand on the pen. But thank you. We'll have more time for Q&A, but thank you so much, Elizabeth. Such a real world description. It's my absolute pleasure now to introduce Christy Breyer, a practicing architect with many years' experience working at the sort of architectural end, if you like, when it comes to actually real life with people and all the things. So I'll just embarrass you with a very glowing summary of who you are. Christy Breyer is a practicing architect who lives near Malakuta in far east Victoria, which for our non-Australian colleagues and friends is a most beautiful part of the world. She has assisted her community with various disaster recovery projects while navigating the rebuild of her own home and office after losing them in the Black Summer fires of 2019-20. She is the director of Christy Breyer Architects and has previously worked with Richard Stampton Architects and Workshop Architecture. She has taught drawing. She has taught drawing in landscape architecture and urban design at RMIT University, and has an interest in broader role that architects can play. So, Christy, thank you so much for joining us, and over to you. You're on mute.
Here we go. Thanks, David, and thanks everyone for tuning in. Today I'm speaking from Bidawal country in Far East Gippsland, and coming here today thinking that I have a fairly different perspective in the conversation, but actually I'm learning that no, that's not true. Like Elizabeth and Brett, I'm a practicing architect that didn't plan on working in disaster, but found myself working in it. I'm also what is known in the disaster circles as a total loss resident. And so what that means is I was internally displaced, I guess is the language that's used. So in 2019, just to give you a little background, I started my own architecture practice in Mallacoota. On New Year's Eve of the same year, I sheltered under a blanket on the wharf at Mallacoota, and then learnt that I lost my home, my office, and everything I own. So in what was now known as the Black Summer bushfires. So this combination of hats, I guess, has given me a pretty invaluable lesson in what it's like to be internally displaced and to rebuild after a disaster. And a spoiler alert, it's bloody hard. 5.5 years later, my partner and I have only just moved into our new home. And I can tell you that we put the planning permit in 3 months after the disaster. So it gives you a sense of the kind of systemic mess that, the bureaucracy and the challenges that are faced by people who are traumatized and probably not best placed to be dealing with that. Anyway, so my falling into disaster work obviously largely was taken up with dealing with that personal experience, but also helping others in the community to rebuild their homes. And as I said, to navigate what is really an unsympathetic recovery system. It's pretty clear to say that the majority of my time in this period, and we're coming up to 6 years since that fire, has not been in building buildings, as you might expect, but drawing on the other skills that we as architects have. And we've heard today from Elizabeth and Brett that, we have a raft of transferable skills that really are best placed for this work in disaster. So 2 years after the fire, I joined the Mallacoota and District Recovery Association, which was a community-led recovery group. And I joined that because I was starting to hear similar stories to my own. People being stuck in the system, being overwhelmed, not knowing how to take any steps forward. And also that Recovery Association, despite all the great work they were doing, they didn't have the language or the skill set, I guess, to work with that cohort of people who had lost everything. They were scared to. I remember really clearly the president at the time said to me, "I've been wanting to talk to you about this, but I've been scared that if I do, I'll make you cry." And, I said to him, "I'll cry anyway, so please come and talk to me." So anyway, I joined that committee and, put in a lot of hard yards, speaking with politicians, advocating for people in my community so that they could be heard. I also, earlier this year, took on a short contract with local government as a bushfire recovery project support officer. That was something that the recovery committee had been advocating for a long time, and that was to have someone with project, project management skill, built environment skills to help communities who were stuck with their projects. So the projects were already up and running, but they weren't moving necessarily. They were, we're talking about communities that are really exhausted already. Their volunteer hours are massive, and then we're putting these big sort of public scale projects on top of them to try and manage. And naturally they weren't succeeding. So I came on board just for 6 months, a sort of baptism by fire. I think I had 75 projects on the books in 6 months to try and help progress them. Obviously, they're not to complete them all, but certainly to progress them and to complete some, which was, rewarding. But I've also been involved with Monash University's Fire to Flourish program, which is a participatory granting project that is looking at better ways of funding after a disaster. So rather than just throwing money at really exhausted communities to try and rebuild their towns, the Fire to Flourish program looks at how to support communities along the way to succeed. And that's actually largely born out of their architecture department at Monash University. So again, here's these architect skills coming to the fore to come up with unique ideas of how we can better operate post-disaster. And so what I'd like to do, I guess because my story is quite personal, I would like to share a couple of stories with you to sort of help illustrate some of the issues that I've experienced. One at a community level and one at an individual level, and how I believe architects can play a role within these. So at the community level, after a disaster, and we see this all the time on the television, the community is bonded together. They're united, they support each other, there's fabulous camaraderie. There's a collective trauma that's occurred that is just simply understood, and the community knows how to respond. And we see that all the time. We saw that with the floods, where, you know, it was people in their own boats and, you know, WhatsApp groups going and rescuing. People know what to do in their own community immediately after a disaster. In Malakuta, we lost 125 houses, and that collective trauma was felt deeply across the whole community, not just those that lost their homes. And with most housing in Malakuta containing asbestos, we're a bit of a 70s, 80s coastal shack town, the state government decided to roll out a coordinated cleanup program rather than leave that to individuals. And what happened then is what I would say is a second collective trauma happened. And what happened at that point is, although the burnt remains of everyone's houses was really distressing, and I think the program took about 7 or 8 months to complete. So burnt houses on the ground for 7 or 8 months. And that was really distressing to look at. But they were still recognisable as part of the fabric of our town. They were our community's homes, and you could still feel the presence of them in the street despite them no longer standing. So seeing these homes scraped up and put in the back of trucks and taken away, leaving behind sort of vacant lots, was this new trauma for the community, and one that they didn't know how to respond to. There was this sense of finality, this character of the town had been changed forever, and leaving us all to wonder what comes next, what will be replaced. And so, I mean, you know yourself that, you know, we often move to a place that we identify with. It might be, you know, the Victorian terraces of Carlton, or, you know, mud brick cottages, or you know, coastal shacks. And it's this character that makes us feel at home and of a place, I guess. And what happens to this character when it is destroyed? Marysville, after the Black Saturday fires, is a really good example to look at, where, you know, a significant part of the built fabric of that town was destroyed and new things replaced. Soon after the fires, COVID hit. We had been already isolated for 6 weeks with roads closed, and then 2 weeks after the road was open, we were in our first lockdown of COVID. And so we all know what that was like. And it obviously made building much more difficult and much more expensive. And so understandably, people turned to prefab housing. And this is not you know, a slight at prefab housing. It has its place. I think maybe there's a role for architects there to do some better stuff. But interestingly, here on the road between here and Melbourne is a prefab company that sits right on the highway. So everyone's really familiar with this company. And suddenly that became an easy way to rebuild homes. And what happened is we suddenly had whole streetscapes that were of this one company of prefab homes. And it starts looking like, you know, showroom for this company. So what we have then is what I would say is a third collective trauma of the community. So even though, like, we have our personal traumas within that, the community is feeling like they're no longer part of the place. The thing they identified with is gone. The new character doesn't speak of the old. And so where I think architects can play a role, and it's something I've been interested in for a long time, is what are our skills that are beyond drawing, is, we can't stop disasters. They're going to be coming, as Elizabeth was talking about, but we can become more resilient to these subsequent traumas that are occurring in the recovery phase. We often talk about the recovery being more difficult than the disaster itself. And so I think architects can play a really significant role in community understanding place and what it means to them, and understanding the values before a disaster could help community heal together through the rebuilding process. And I think that's, understanding the built environment and place, and working with state and local governments, perhaps we can tailor support more specifically. We can reach out to our network in the built environment industry and just be, more specific to place, rather than a kind of one size fits all model, which we know doesn't work. And so I'm not saying that architects should come in and try and help replicate what's been lost in the past, but we can help interpret what it is that's valuable about that can then be rebuilt in the future. And so in a way, I kind of look at it as the architect being a guiding hand rather than, making decisions. And so again, this guiding hand, it brings me to a more personal or individual level of what happens after a disaster. And that is, when we're faced with disaster, our brain goes into fight or flight mode, which we're largely all aware of. And if neither of those options is available to you, there's another part that your brain goes into, and it's called a freeze mode. And that prepares us for the prospect of dying in the face of disaster. It's a pretty terrifying place to be. And what happens physiologically, our brains literally move aside all of the information that's no longer necessary for survival and just works on a very primal setting. So once the threat of disaster has passed and you're safe and you're, safe to a degree, I say, the brain remains in this survival mode for quite some time afterward. It can be years, in fact. And then suffering additional traumas on top of that, such as learning that you've lost your home or a loved one, or even, COVID 6 weeks after the fire, that just compounds this state. And so people get stuck in a way of, a PTSD, and are unable or unfit for making the decisions that they're going to need to make in recovery. So I experienced this very much so. I found that my cognitive ability was, completely impaired. Even basic language was difficult for me. And I was very easily overwhelmed and distressed. Things were upsetting very easily. And typically it's at this point in time where loads and loads of offer for support comes in from all sorts of people, eager to help. And then suddenly you have a full-time job of filling out forms and reliving your story and proving your loss and reliving your trauma and telling it over and over and over again. So again, you're putting yourself back in this space. You're being stuck in this primal thinking. And this is the time that when you're in this place, that the pressure starts to build as to what are my next steps? Where am I going to live? I can't live in the emergency relief centre for the rest of my life, or I can't live in the swag. In my case, a swag in a paddock. What am I going to do next? And we all know that building is difficult at any stage of your life, let alone when you're in this state of mind. The psychological risk during the rebuilding process for survivors is extremely high. So high levels of adrenaline and cortisol can make, really small things or setbacks or bureaucratic processes, or someone in local government saying, no, you can't do that, or whatever it might be, that normally you would just sort of feel like it's annoying or disappointing. It feels like another threat to your survival. It feels like it's roadblock to your well-being, I guess, and life, your basic human rights and needs. So where I believe architects can make a real difference in this is not necessarily coming in and building houses and infrastructure and making all the decisions, but again, this guiding hand, providing this guiding hand through a process at the pace and the place that the resident or the community is at. So that's a really important point, is that it's slow. It's very slow work. It's really important to balance between simplifying decision-making, which architects have to do for our clients all the time, while also allowing people in the community to choose for themselves. Giving them agency provides a sense of control in what is a really disorganised brain, and their world is disorganised at that time. So once again, a loss of control to the primal thinking brain is a threat to survival. So we often hear in working with disaster affected communities the term walking alongside with, and it is a lovely term, but I feel like it's slightly misplaced. I feel like the role of architects is not to walk alongside, but rather provide a safety net underneath people, allowing people to make their own way, but to be supported the whole way if and when required. So it's a bit different to maybe when, as architects in our traditional commission-based work, where we kind of are walking alongside. We're making decisions, we're pushing a project, we're channeling in a particular direction. But I think in disaster work, that's not our role. Our role is definitely the if and when required. So we might not be involved in a whole project, for example. So I think, yes, we can design buildings, but so can other people, draftees, prefab companies, AI. That's not a skill really anymore. Our skills as architects, I believe, are all the other things, and Elizabeth mentioned a few of them before, but it's the complex problem solving, listening and reading between the lines. So I'm going to read these because I don't miss any out, but facilitating people's different ideas into a single solution, working in a dynamic of emotional personal relationships. We often have to do that in our practice work. Connecting with others in the industry, understanding the process of building and moving through that in an organised way right through to the end. And I think that's where our skills come from, is this, we're very practiced at being organised and knowing what to do. And coming into disaster work is a very disorganised environment. So we have the skills to bring to it. We just need to work at the pace of the space, of the people. We can't come in at our normal rate. So I believe, and this is sort of where I'm trying to do some work at the moment, is that architects can get in on the ground early and partner with state and local governments to provide a kind of guidance that we're used to providing to our clients. The difference being, in disaster setting is not a commission to build something, as I said. It's rather gently supporting a client in the background through a process that we're used to doing, moving at their pace and not at the pace of profit. To answer the question about, what do I wish more architects understood about disasters? I think, like Elizabeth said, unless you've lived one, there's so much more you understand going through it and understanding the complexity, the emotional complexity that's involved. And I don't think you could ever understand it without living that. But what we can do, and I've got some points here, again, move at the pace of those you're working with. Trauma psychology, so know this, trauma psychology affects the brain and its ability to make decisions. So we're working with people that might not be able to make those decisions, or might chop and change a million times because they're uncertain. So you need to be extremely patient, a gentle person. Small things can be overwhelming and triggering. Your client or your community will likely not be excited about the projects. And this is something that comes up all the time, where people, when they're rebuilding and trying to get their lives back on track, and everyone says, oh, you must be really excited. People aren't excited, they're grieving. So understand that you're dealing with grief. It's not like building a new home because you're sitting in your already nice home and you want to build a bigger home. So it's a really traumatic process. Again, architects aren't there just to build buildings. I think we can play a vital role in communities before and after disasters, by helping communities understand the place and the built environment in which they live, to articulate those values and that are shared and important. There's a little bit of work going on here locally with what is now called a community plan. I found that communities that already had a community plan before the disaster responded much better in the post-disaster context. In Mallacoota, we didn't have one. We started from scratch in a traumatised state. So we didn't already collectively have a set of, I guess, priorities and values for our town. When we did the recovery plan, there were 175 priorities on that list, which is just ginormous. Whereas communities that had already developed a plan about their values, about what they enjoy about their town, what are the things they'd like to have in the future, what makes them stronger, those communities responded much more easily. They already had the framework around them to start making moves in the right direction. We kind of ran around lost for quite some time, I would say. The other thing is architects get very little of the building work after a disaster. We get very little of the building work full stop in Australia, but after a disaster, everyone's not running to architects. So if you're wanting to get involved in disaster work, ask yourself the question, where are we more useful? And it's not in building buildings. It is understanding community. It's consultation. It's about how they would like to build back, and then assisting people to source the best way to do that for themselves. And again, this could be, getting in at the ground level with state and local government. There's not one size that fits all. Disaster affects people in so many different ways and at different times. I recall only about a year ago going to an information session with trauma psychologist Rob Gordon. And, it was an information session about post recovery, like, okay, we're past recovery and where are we at now? And a farmer came along and he told his fire story for the first time. This is 4.5 years after the fire. It took him that long to realise he wasn't coping, managing it all by himself. So we have to understand that, the time frames on this, what I've noticed in disaster is at the beginning when they're at the emergency housing shelter part of a disaster, everyone kind of knows what to do. That's a simple part. Everyone's at the same point. And then time stretches out and people are at different points and have different needs throughout that. And that's when it starts to become really tricky for government. And then the thing I'd just like to finish up on is just to say what I've learned is that people are inherently resilient. Building strongly connected communities, building social capital, practicing working together on things in normal times, I guess, is what strengthens that resilience even more and prepares us for future challenges. It's how we can bounce back quickly when we're used to working together strongly. So that's where I'll leave for today.
Christy, that's incredibly powerful. And I think all of us listening to you are grateful for the candor and the openness with which you've talked about things, a very personal perspective. Elizabeth mentioned that lived experience is everything. And you talked about the 3 collective traumas. My colleague Kate often talks about the disaster after the disaster, well-meaning systems, but then you say 3 months after you put it in and it takes 5 years. These systems which stop us, intended to be good, actually block us at every level. And unwittingly, the systems. Anyway, let's yes, going from that. I'm mindful we have about 5, 6 minutes left. If anybody would like to post a question on the Q&A, please do so. But until that moment happens, oh, thank you, Kate. You read my mind. If we could have the team back together, and I'll ask you just to be brief, panel. I've got one question for each of you. Just forget we're human beings before that, to state the sort of obvious, before designers. Take ourselves out from that. We were all teenagers thinking about going into a profession. I want to ask you, looking back at it now, did the choices you make of architect, landscape architect, how well did that profession equip you for being a human being engaging in disasters? Brett, maybe you can kick us off.
Thanks, David. That's kind of a career question in some ways and a personal question in others.
Existential, hey?
It is actually very much. I mean, I think broadly that an architectural education, both speakers have said the same, an architectural education, it's a great thing, and it is this kind of interesting balance between the sciences and the humanities, plus something else. I think that it's unfortunate in some ways the way that we're taught architecture, because it, I think, defaults to reinforcing this idea that you just have to project manage and just kind of project manage the hell out of something and just apply more resources. And then once you've done that, everything's going to be right. And that it doesn't adequately equip you to be able to work equally in teams. And I think some of my own best and most satisfying work has come when I sat back and kind of pulled myself back and learned from educators, from teachers, from people coming from a background of health, nurses, doctors, others, where they are used to working in teams in a vastly different way than the way architects are trained. And I think that then you see yourself more as in that role of, facilitator, enabler, and something else. And that's when you can truly work with communities better, because you let them lead and you let them be in the front, and you can help just kind of pull things together and draw the dots and provide alternatives, but not going in there like it's a traditional client-architect relationship. I think that's something that I very much learned, but also the privilege that, and this sounds a bit selfish, but the privilege that being able to work in complicated contexts has been able to give me to understand and give insight to the human condition in a way that I probably wouldn't have if I was living a 9-to-5 office job, which I clearly don't think I would have been satisfied doing. But yeah.
Beautiful. I'm afraid we have 3-4 minutes. Elizabeth.
Well, being a landscape architect is like the opposite of being an architect. And I think it's actually a great foundation because of the fact that you are trained to work with uncertainty and change, and very much thinking about things in a systematic way and thinking about things that are living, and that there is this inherent complexity between the living world and the non-living world, and how we provide this kind of stewardship of these systems. So I actually think landscape architecture is an excellent grounding for.
That's an aha for me, hearing you say that. That's really, really fascinating. Cool. Thank you. And Christy, you provided the image of the safety net and not even walking alongside those things for you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe I'm slightly younger and have been trained a little bit different here in Melbourne, but I certainly, in my architecture training, was very much guided by what are the skills of architects, that we're not just draw buildings. So it's something that's been a long interest of mine, from a sort of I guess a pillar or a type of architecture training that was centered on social justice and human needs, and so that's been really informative for me. But then I guess you're drawn to those things because you already have that within you as well. Those that don't are probably off doing parametrics, but we're those of us that already have that sort of sense, Brett talked about before of the politics and humanitarian need and things like that. There's a real pathway there already. So I think it's on the right track, and the fact that there are now study in disaster, recovery and resilience. So that's something that wasn't available when I was studying. So it's already becoming more, more common language, I guess, within our industry.
No, I couldn't agree more, Christy. And as you said, Elizabeth, we will be designing with heat and with the frequency of disasters and so many things. I'm really sorry to say our time's up. I wish we could talk for another hour. I personally just found that immensely interesting. Genuinely, people who really know what they're talking about, wrapped up in these things. Brett, you talked about how architectural education assumes the private sector somewhat elitist. You didn't say that, but I think it's safe to say thing. But then you say, Christy, actually, an awful lot of architectural education is not about that. And then Elizabeth, you say landscape architecture is the opposite. It's about being stewards of process and so many other things and the uncertainties that are around. I trained as an architect a million years ago, and if I had my time again, I would do exactly the same thing because I think the design professions are one of the biggest privileges to be involved in on so many levels. And like every profession, it can be better. And the challenges we have the next few decades mean we have to be. But I'm sorry to say we need to wrap up there. Elizabeth Mossop and Christy Breyer and Brett Moore, thank you so much for your time for that. This will be recorded and out there. I'm sure we'll have a lot of views and viewers. We're all on LinkedIn, I think. So I think we're all eminently contactable. I'm grateful to Kate for organising this, for our friends and colleagues at ADAR for co-doing this with us. Our next session is in 2 days' time at 12 p.m. Sydney time. Please join us to talk about getting ready before the disaster, knowing they're all linked in reality, of course, with 3 great people. And we'll be sending out a questionnaire, and please, if you have a moment, fill in. So thank you so much, and goodbye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you,
So
David.
everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.